Welcome to the 17th annual Gus and Libby Solomon Memorial Lecture. My name is Natan Meir, and I have the privilege of serving as Academic Director of the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies. As usual, I would like to begin by thanking Dick Solomon and Elise Flitcraft, the sponsors of tonight's event. The namesakes of tonight's lecture, Gus and Libby Solomon of blessed memory, were both pillars of the community, both the broader Portland community and the city's Jewish community. Standing here in my office on the Portland State campus, I am mindful that Gus was born and grew up only a few blocks away from here and went to Shattuck School, which is today a PSU classroom building. He went on to a long and illustrious career in the law, the pinnacle of which was the federal judgeship that he held for over 2 decades. In both professional and personal spheres, he championed the rights of Jews, African Americans, and others on the margins of the American mainstream at the time. His wife, Libby, shared his progressive politics, organizing training groups for women in the Democratic Party, advocating for civil rights, and fighting discrimination. We are honored that Dick and Elise have chosen to memorialize them by means of this annual lecture, which brings new and innovative interpretations of the American Jewish experience to a wide audience. I also want to warmly thank our co-sponsors for this evening's lecture, the Oregon Jewish Community Foundation, the Jewish Federation of Greater Portland, the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, and PSU's Department of Sociology. Now I'd like to ask Shelley Shaban, Vice Provost for Academic Personnel and Dean of Interdisciplinary General Education, to say a few words of welcome. Shelley's title may sound intimidating, but she is just the opposite of that. Those who have the pleasure to work with her know her as exceptionally approachable, modeling a warm and compassionate style of leadership. As Vice Provost, she directs leadership training and development of deans and chairs, and facilitates communication among faculty, union representatives, and administrators, among many other responsibilities. We're also honored to have her as a member of the Judaic Studies Program's Advisory Committee. I'm delighted that she is here with us tonight. Shelley.
Hello, and Natan, thank you for that beautiful introduction. It is my sincere pleasure to welcome all of you to the 17th annual Gus and Libby Solomon Memorial Lecture, a treasured tradition of the Harold Schnitzer Family Program in Judaic Studies, a highlight of the year at Portland State, and a personal favorite for me. Dick Solomon and Elise Flitcraft are longtime supporters of PSU's Judaic Studies program and of this institution. Over the years, they have generously hosted a wide range of acclaimed and provocative speakers. As a proud member of the Judaic Studies Advisory Committee, I can attest to its deep roots in the community and the extent to which it is in turn nourished by community members like yourselves who audit courses, mentor students, offer advice, volunteer, serve on committees, and attend events such as this one. It is energizing to be able to come together, albeit by Zoom, on this joyous occasion to hear Dr. Bitton. The volatility of the last years tested our stamina as a community and was marked by a pandemic, economic instability, social and political unrest, an insurrection, fires, climate change, Afghanistan, Russia, as well as personal experiences with illness, loss, isolation, layoffs, racism, and anti-Semitism. Each of us feels the impact of these events and grieves for those affected. Despite the pain and sadness, your presence this evening is a testimony to your unwavering commitment to our Judaic Studies program and of the courage and resolve we have gained from each other over the past 23 months. Community has never felt more necessary or more key to our ability to cope and to succeed than in these unsettling times. All of us here tonight are bound by our history, our hope, and our diversity. In closing, I wanted to share a statement made by Justice Louis Brandeis in 1927. If there be time to expose through discussion the falsehood and fallacies, to avert the evil by the processes of education, the remedy to be applied is more speech, not enforced silence. May 2022 be filled with many opportunities for education, conversation, encouragement, renewal, and faith in our common humanity, as together we defeat COVID, racism, and anti-Semitism, and hate of all kinds. Thank you.
Thanks so much for those inspiring words, Shelley. Now I'd like to ask Todd Rosenstiel, Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences, to offer some brief remarks. Since his appointment in 2020, Todd has encouraged us as a college to examine carefully what we do in the realms of teaching and research, and how we might do it better, more effectively and efficiently, while always centering student success and equity and inclusion. I'm particularly grateful that he's been a champion of the humanities and a good friend to Judaic studies. I think it's worth adding that Todd somehow manages to find the time to continue his research in plant biology, focusing on the interactions between trees, atmospheric chemistry, human health, and climate change. Thanks so much for joining us tonight, Todd.
Thank you, Natan. Thank you so much for being here. So my name is Todd Rosenstiel. I'm a PSU biology professor, and I am the Dean of the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at PSU. Welcome virtually to PSU's campus. As Natan shared, this is the 17th year we have gathered for the annual Gus and Libby Solomon Lecture Series. It's certainly one of the highlights of our year, and it's Judaic Studies program's flagship event. So we are so delighted that Dick Solomon, of course himself a PSU alum, and Elise Flitcraft are continuing this tradition. And we are so grateful for their continued steadfast support of the Judaic Studies program, and of course for Portland State. So I am delighted to welcome you here this evening to join this program on behalf of Portland State University and on behalf of the 24 academic departments in our College of Liberal Arts and Sciences. You know, our college represents nearly half of Portland State, and it has programs as diverse and as critical and essential as departments such as Judaic Studies and History and World Languages, English, Mathematics, Chemistry, Philosophy, Sociology, and 16 others as well. So I am sorry we are not gathering together in person tonight in the Smith Ballroom. I really miss gathering together in the Smith Ballroom. Hopefully next year we will be back in person on PSU's campus. But I am certain next year we will be back together again. And although this pandemic continues to rage on, we are coming out of this. And here at PSU, we are back in person on campus, even though some of our courses are still being taught remotely. And we are really ready to take on the challenges of this new era. You know, our institution, like so many that you are involved in, you know, we really took for granted certain aspects of what life was like before this pandemic. And it's clearly we are being shaped by what we've all experienced together. Indeed, the fact that we are gathering here tonight remotely and instead of in the Smith Ballroom really speaks to that adaptability and flexibility of our time. So like many of your organizations, our college is not going to return as we were before this pandemic. For many of us, that's both a little scary, but also super exciting. Like most of you, we too are trying to learn from this pandemic as a college and as a university. Man, we are on our way to returning even stronger, even more student-centered, and much, much more future-ready. And as my colleague Ted Van Alst, chair of Indigenous Nation Studies and director of our School of Gender, Race, and Nation says, you know, we simply aren't returning, we aren't simply returning out of this pandemic. We are indeed returning to new. Like tonight's Solomon Lecture, many of our college's amazing events are now fully online or Zoom accessible, which means that there are many ways for you to either get involved and stay involved in PSU's campus life. And I hope you take advantage of these. There are some amazing opportunities for community members to engage with PSU, from our senior auditor program, which is amazing, to a rich array of public programs and events. I would personally encourage you to consider signing up for our college's weekly newsletter. It'll alert you every week to the many exciting events happening on campus. You simply need to send an email to my dean's office and we'll get your name on the list. And in fact, I just dropped the email there in the chat. If you'd like to be added to that list, I hope you do. So as you know, PSU is a public institution of higher ed, and I believe strongly that public education is an essential and fundamental tenet of a just and civic society. Indeed, our faculty are proud of the transformative roles we have on the lives of Oregonians. You know, we transform students' lives, families' lives, and indeed communities' lives. Indeed, we are one of the top universities for advancing social mobility in the Pacific Northwest. In fact, we're #1 in Oregon. And we actually rank in the top 10% nationwide. I love this ranking and what this says about PSU because it compares us to all the other US colleges and universities in our ability to enroll students who come from low-income backgrounds and graduate them into meaningful and well-paying jobs. I just share this with you tonight as I want to ask you to help us advance our mission of changing the lives and communities we all love. Help us tell our story. Tell people you know about all the wonderful work that is being done here in Judaic Studies by Natan and his colleagues, in our college and across PSU. We have a wonderful value proposition at a time of growing economic inequality, and it's a value proposition that is desperately needed. With colleagues like Natan and the Faculty of Judaic Studies and throughout our college, we offer an excellent education at a reasonable cost, and we want people to know about it. So thank you for joining us tonight and for continuing to support the change we all hope to see in this world. Thank you, and welcome to PSU. Natan.
Thanks so much, Todd. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, I first just want to encourage you all to join our mailing list. If you don't already receive our relatively infrequent e-newsletters, you'll receive notice of upcoming courses. For example, our courses for spring term, which starts in late March, include courses on the New Testament, retelling the Bible, sex, love, and gender in Israel, and my new course, which I'm excited about, which is called Yiddish Folklore and Culture. And you'll also hear about our special events, such as our Levy event, which is coming up this spring, which will focus on Nobel Prize winner Olga Tokarczuk's The Books of Jacob. To sign up for the newsletter, all you have to do is click on the link that I just dropped into the chat. I also would like to encourage you to consider making a donation to support the Gus and Libby Solomon Lecture Series. Many of you here tonight are already supporters of the Judaic Studies program, and we're very grateful for your continuing support. If you're not a supporter, please consider that it takes resources to offer free events such as these to the public, and we would welcome you as partners in our wide range of academic and programmatic initiatives. And I just dropped another link into the chat, which is the link to donation. And lastly, you can help us by, as Todd said, by spreading the word. And in this case, spreading the word about our flagship scholarship program, the Harold Schnitzer Family Scholarship, which offers Judaic Studies majors up to $7,000 annually. Actually, at this point, it's a little bit over $7,000 towards tuition and fees for up to 4 years. It's an opportunity for excellent education that is also affordable. And the link to the information about the scholarship is there now in the chat. I want to thank the people who work behind the scenes to make this event possible. Suzanne Van Amberg, our strategic communications coordinator, and Claire Quinn, Christy Kolesnikov, and Christina Rojas in the class dean's office. A reminder, this is a webinar, so you can see us, the presenters, but we can't see you, so sit back and relax. If you have questions for our speaker, please type them into the Q&A box. We've disabled chat for tonight, and I will do my best to choose a wide selection of questions to pose to our speaker after she has finished her formal presentation. Also, we have a live transcript, closed captioning available. You'll see the button on the bottom of your screen. Now it's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Mijal Bitton. Dr. Bitton is a teacher, writer, and leading thinker on questions relating to Jewish American identity, Sephardic Jews, pluralism, gender equity, and sociological diversity. She is scholar in residence at the Shalom Hartman Institute of North America and co-founder and Rosh Kehillah, or communal leader, of the downtown Minyan in New York City. Dr. Bitton earned her doctorate from New York University and is an alumna of the Wexner Graduate Fellowship Program. Her lecture tonight is entitled American Jews in 2022, Who Counts and Why That's Important. Dr. Bitton.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. I just want to start by saying that I haven't been to Portland yet, but after hearing all the really beautiful introductions and seeing Todd's background of the beautiful campus, I really hope to visit one day in person and really appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and be able to learn together and ask some big questions. I'll say also that part of the reason that I was excited for this presentation and that I was just intrigued by the general memorial lecture is that we really have an interesting intersection here of questions that have to do with scholarship, with academic inquiry, but are also intersecting with really important communal and social concerns, and that are pretty personal for many of us. So I hope tonight to have a presentation that incorporates my research, some of my own personal history, and also some of the communal work that I do with regards to questions around diversity within the American Jewish community. I'll start off by just saying a little bit about my own background, because it does matter here in terms of what drew me to my research. As you might hear from my accent, I wasn't born in the US. I am South American. I am Argentinian and grew up in between Argentina, Israel, and Uruguay. When I was 12, my family moved to the US. And here I was part of different Jewish communities that made me like an sociologist in training of American Jews. I was especially involved in, I lived for years in a Persian Jewish community in Long Island here in New York, and also participated in many modern Orthodox American Jewish institutions. So I had this like diversity of experiences, both in terms of my immigrant background, my own ethnic background. I'm Syrian, Moroccan, and Spanish, and also just having seen different Jewish communities in the US and being able to learn from each of them about how they're structured and how they negotiate different aspects of maintaining a Jewish community in America. When I ended up making my way to pursue my graduate studies at NYU, I became very intrigued by big questions relating to the sociology of Jewish Americans and the history of American Jews. And very quickly, I realized that a lot of the subjects that I was very familiar with in terms of my own family and my own community were somewhat absent from the scholarship. I would read survey data about American Jews, for example, and I would notice that they would only use categories of religiosity that had to do with like denominations like Orthodoxy, Reform, Conservative, Reconstructionist, and denominations, as an example, actually weren't part of the history of Sephardic Jews, especially those from the Middle East and Northern Africa. So that was like one place, for example, in which I would read survey data and I would say, we don't even have some of the questions here that we need to capture some of the Jews that I'm familiar with. And this absence felt really powerful to me, not only because of diversity's sake. What I mean by this is that it wasn't only that certain subjects were missing from the literature and from the scholarship, but I felt and I feel pretty strongly that this absence ends up resulting in a lack of, that we end up missing out on exploring new vistas for old questions. So for example, how do Jews negotiate integration in America? How do they negotiate questions of assimilation, questions of upward mobility, a whole array of questions that if we don't explore certain communities, we end up just not gaining a better understanding of different opportunities and possibilities that exist not only for Jews in America, but for minority groups in general. So being in school and kind of feeling this absence just in terms of the Jews and the Judaism that I was very familiar with and the scholarship that I was excited by, I took it as an opportunity and as a challenge to decide to do my own research and to focus my own work in trying to understand and describe some of those American Jews who were absent from the scholarship. I focused my work, as Natan said earlier, I focused my work studying Syrian Jews, and that's who I did my dissertation on. Let me start now just sharing some slides, because I want to start actually with a story that I learned from my research. So give me just a second as I share my PowerPoint. All right, great. There's also a story that I want to start with, because I think it really illustrates some of the concerns that I'm moved by and that I hope to communicate here in this lecture. This was part of a collection from something called the Sephardic Archives. And it was a group of interviews that researchers conducted in the 80s with Syrian Jews. And there's no actual information about exactly who gave this interview, but it happened with a Syrian Jewish man who was reflecting on his experiences in the Lower East Side as a new immigrant to America. So he told this story to the interviewer who was interviewing him. And he said the following. He's describing again his time as a young man in the Lower East Side. He said, "We had little gatherings very often in my girlfriend's house. I would bring my friends over. Some Syrian friends used to come over to our house, have little parties, dance and drink some soda. Her grandfather used to sit in the kitchen and read his Jewish newspaper, The Forward. Now, I could not read Yiddish. I knew how to read Hebrew letters, but I could not read Yiddish. I wore a very dark hat pulled down over my hair and a big dark coat wrapped around me, and my skin was dark. I looked like an Italian. So Shirley, his girlfriend, said to her grandfather that I'm Jewish. He says to her, 'Baloney, this guy's no Jew.' She says to him, 'Yes, he is.' She says to me, 'Go prove it.' I don't know if I would have wanted to be him, of my partner telling me to go prove my Jewishness. But the story continues. So he says, the grandfather goes to him. He's going to test him now. And he says, here's the Jewish Forward. Read it. Now, back then, the Jewish Forward, which was one of the most popular Jewish newspapers at the time, was written in Yiddish, right? So this young Syrian man, who is now given the Forward to read, looks at it and he says, "I can't read this, Mr. Rosenblum." He says, "You can't?" He cannot understand that there can be a Jew in his neighborhood in the Lower East Side who cannot read the Forward. That was a marker of Jewishness and Jewish identity for him at this time. But the story continues. So he says, "Just a minute. I can't read that newspaper, but I know the letters." So he goes and he starts pointing. He says, "This is Aleph, the first letter in the Hebrew alphabet, also used for Yiddish. This is Bet, this is Gimel, continues with other letters. But I'll do better than that. In those days," he's reflecting, right? "I was very learned in the Torah, in Jewish knowledge, from my Hebrew school and all that. I said, 'What prayer would you like?' 'What do you mean?' the grandfather asked. So I said, 'What prayer would you like? Wine?' He says, 'Do you want me to give you the bracha, the prayer for wine?' And he starts reciting out loud, 'Baruch atah borei pri hagafen,' which is the traditional Hebrew blessing that we make for wine, so on and so forth. He was stunned. The grandfather was stunned. Anything he asked for, I rattled off. In fact, I could go through a whole morning and evening prayer by heart. I started rattling, and he says, 'That's enough. Stop. You're Jewish, but you don't look it.' I say, 'Well, but I am. I'm Syrian.' And the response, and like the punchline, is, 'Syrian Jew. What the hell is a Syrian Jew?' Now, I love this story. There's like so many interesting and intriguing and complicated and dark aspects to this story. And part of the reason that I bring it is that we see here that there is almost like a lack of knowledge, sometimes about Jews who are not part of like our normative assumptions, right, of who American Jews are and what they look like. And what we see here is that this lack of knowledge is not only about the existence of Jews who are different, but also their Judaism. How do they practice? What language do they use to communicate? How do they understand what it means to be Jewish? There was here not only an absence of knowledge that Syrian Jews exist merely as subjects, but that they actually represent a whole other way to negotiate what it means to be Jewish in America and what it means to be Jewish more generally. I'll also say that one of the things that I take from this story, and this is the optimist in me, I actually love the fact that this young and pretty bright man was able to, in a sense, argue for a sense of commonality. That even though we might speak different languages and come from different places and maybe even look differently from each other, there's some things that we have in common. And he's able to find the Hebrew alphabet and some liturgical prayers, and in a sense, implicitly argue for a shared bond that they have together. I bring this story because a lot of the work that I have been involved with, both in terms of my scholarship, but also a lot of the work that I do is more like public facing in terms of teaching and writing. I have really felt like I have become a bit of an advocate to insist that if we're going to talk about American Jews, we need to have conversations that take seriously the diversity of American Jews. And this cannot be a shallow sense of diversity. It has to be a diversity, a complex diversity project that takes into account that Jews, we look differently from each other, we come from different places, we have different histories, sometimes different languages, different food. I would also argue different negotiations of Jewishness, different ideas about morality, about politics, and that we need to really engage with this, with a robust diversity project that demands from us to kind of like question some of the normative assumptions that we have about who American Jews are, and that hopefully teach us not only about Jews who are different than us, but maybe also a little bit more about our own sense of Jewishness and about the trajectories that brought us to where we are right now. So with this introduction, what I'm going to do for the remainder of our conversation is I want to introduce two sets of questions, okay? The first set of questions has to do with the exercise of trying to figure out the classification that we want to use, the researchers want to use when talking about ethnic and racial diversity of Jews. So that's like the first set of questions. I want to introduce all of us to some of the work that sociologists are doing to raise the profile of different populations that have been marginalized in terms of the research, and try to also, part of what I hope to do is to actually show how when we have a field that is on its stages of development, that there's actually really important questions that we need to ask in terms of how researchers use different categories and how they think of different populations. That's the first set of questions that I want us to consider. The second set of questions that I'm going to share is going to be about representation, about what does it mean, you know, in the intersection between scholarship and community, what does it mean to actually have a diversity project that is trying to raise the representation of different and diverse Jews? And what are the moral, ethical, political, and communal questions, some of the moral political questions that we might want to keep in the forefront of our minds as we engage in these different projects. So let me start with the first thing that I wanted to share, and I'll do so first by sharing a quote. I just love this quote. It's from a Sephardic Nobel laureate, Elias Canetti, who says Jews are different from other people, but in reality, they're most different from each other. I feel like I keep this, you know, in my desk just to remind me of this, and I take this as something really beautiful and something really positive in terms of thinking about the diversity of Jews in general and of American Jews more specifically. So let me start by just sharing some data from the latest Pew on Jewish Americans, okay? And part of what's interesting about this data, and I got all of this, it's all available in the report online if you want it. Part of what's interesting about this data is that they didn't ask some of these questions in their earlier study in 2013. So just the presence of some, not all, but some of this data already tells us something positive, right? About the increased awareness, about the need for research to interrogate different assumptions about who Jews are and to try to dig deeper into, you know, the diversity of American Jews. So let me name here some of these like axes of diversity that Pew decided to focus on. Let me just like name them, and then I'm going to choose two of them to interrogate and to complicate. According to Pew 2020, 8% of American Jews identify as non-white and or Hispanic. Two things to note here, this percentage changes if you go to younger generations of American Jews. So we clearly see that as American Jews get younger, that we have higher rates of ethnic and racial diversity in our communities. And I'll just note here something just, in terms of like classification, this includes, let's say, like Hispanic Jews. Some of them might identify, for example, as like Hispanic and white, okay? But generally, when we're trying to think about non-white or Hispanic, so 8% of American Jews, that's the figure that Pew gives for this population. The next percentage point that I just want to highlight here and point out is that 7% of American Jews self-identify as Sephardic or Mizrahi. Okay, what do these categories exactly mean? I'm going to get to it, at least with my questions. But this was actually, I was really happy that we had this data, even though I have some questions about how they asked it. But they didn't ask questions about Sephardic or Mizrahi identification in 2013. So this to me was like really welcome development that tells us something about new vistas in terms of our understanding of communities that perhaps weren't seen as part of the mainstream narratives of American Jews. And then the third layer of diversity that Pew chooses to highlight in their chapter on ethnic and racial diversity is that of immigration. And they explain that 10% of American Jews are immigrants. Now, having shared this, part of what I want to argue is that even as we should applaud these new research directions and the fact that we have increased attention to study and research different aspects of American Jewish diversity, that we need to realize that this field, it's on its nascent. I don't know if I'm saying that word right, but like it's in initial or new stages. And actually there's a lot of really important questions and complexities and also arguments amongst scholars, amongst activists, amongst people in this field who are trying to figure out how do we most accurately give space to describe the diversity that we see in front of us. So I'm going to focus right now on two layers of diversity and share with you some of the questions that as a researcher I face or like difference of opinions the researchers have in the way that they approach these categories. So let me start with the initial number that I shared, which is that 8% of American Jews are non-white and or Hispanic. Right now, some of the conversation that is occurring amongst researchers, activists also, I would say, and academics really has to do with what are the right categories that we should be using to talk about Jews who are non-white or Jews of color. That's a category that has increased in prominence and in popularity and importance in the past couple of years. And what I find important to emphasize is that amongst researchers and also amongst self-identified Jews of color themselves, right? There is actual disagreement about who exactly fits in this category. When I say Jews of color, when I talk about this category, who am I including here? This ends up, by the way, leading to different opinions in terms of the size of this population. Let me just name right now, at least from my understanding, from having reviewed a lot of the both the academic literature and also the popular discourse around this. These are the three main ways that I've identified that individuals think about the category of Jews of color, or when really we're focused on like the racial diversity of American Jews. The first one is a category that would say Jews who are non-white and or Hispanic and or other, right? All of this should be put together when we're trying to talk about who Jews of color are. So there's an important study that came out of Stanford in 2019 called Counting Inconsistencies. They didn't necessarily pose a formal definition of Jews of color, but in their analysis, the way that they put their different demographic estimates together, walking backwards, this is the working definition that they have in terms of who they include in the categorization of Jews of color. Next definition is a definition that says Jews of color are non-white plus Hispanic plus other plus Sephardic and or Mizrahi Jews. So for example, there is an activist and a scholar called Manishtana. This is the way that he defines Jews of color, and is a prominent Black Jew who talks a lot about questions of Jews and whiteness and race. Lewis Gordon, who's a scholar, also uses this to talk about different racial categories of American Jews. And part of the way that I understand this, this paradigm is that when we talk about Jews of color, we're really talking about Jews who have been out of, let's say, like a white Ashkenazi mainstream, right? So we want to try to focus our sense of diversity on these groups that haven't been part of like the normative kind of like center of gravity in terms of American Jewish institutions and American Jewish life. There's also the approach that some researchers take, and I would even argue that some activists or communal leaders take as well, in which they say, actually, these broad umbrella categories can be a little bit complicated because we don't know if they necessarily match up with the self-identification of all the populations that you're putting in that same category. Or another question that people might have is to say, well, you know, we haven't interrogated enough the relationship between those who choose, let's say, like other, and then those who choose like a competing racial or ethnic category in whatever surveys. So this approach, and you can see this in Pew, for example, and of course, Pew has to be consistent in terms of all the other surveys they do with other groups, but it will be an approach that tries to say, you know, when we're doing this research and trying to raise this diversity, maybe we shouldn't use, as of now, these big umbrella terms, especially if we haven't necessarily studied whether all the populations included identify with it, and we can continue using more discrete and more narrow terms. We can talk about Hispanic Jews, and we can talk about Asian Jews, and we can talk about, you know, Sephardic Jews and the like, and we have to be a little bit more narrow and I would say a little bit more precise in the way that we align categories with self-identification. So I'm sharing this here. Part of the reason that I'm sharing this is that I think that as we promote questions and research and scholarship and conversations about diversity, we need to lean into the complexity of these conversations. And we need to lean into the fact that we're going to have some really important questions and nuance to kind of wade through, both as researchers and as community leaders who are trying to figure out how do we best highlight the parts of our communities and give voice to individuals and groups who weren't as represented previously. I'm going to just right now also do something similar and different regarding the category of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews, because again, what I hope to do is to complicate some of the, not only the fact that we need to begin asking questions about these populations, but that it takes a lot of work to figure out how to ask questions about all these populations. So I'm just gonna like name some things here. You know, when we say Sephardic and or Mizrahi, what do we mean by that? And I'll tell you something that part of my struggle or my frustration as a researcher who studies Sephardic Jews is that sometimes I feel like I'm asking questions like to the void. What I mean by this is that part of the absence of research in this field is like the absence of attention paid to some critical questions. So we nearly have no scholarship in terms of contemporary American Jews, of researchers even asking, what do these categories mean? We don't actually have that robust conversation, which by the way does exist in scholarship of Israeli Jews. But I'm advocating that we should be asking these questions. And I'm naming right now 3 really important definitional questions for anybody who wants to try to begin understanding this population of Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. I'll name them. First question I put here, it's what's the difference between Sephardic and Mizrahi? In many spaces that I'm in right now, people use them in a way that is sometimes interchangeable, sometimes blurred with each other. In other spaces, I see them used in a way that I think isn't necessarily responding to the scholarship that we do have. So as an example, there is significant scholarship in Israel that describes the emergence of the category of Mizrahiyut, right, which applied mainly, I'm going to simplify for a second, but applied mainly to Jews coming from the Middle East or Northern Africa. But for example, this category, which academics describe as emerging in a particular Israeli context, we haven't done enough work to figure out, does it work in an American context, right? What is the actual what is the actual difference between these two categories? Are these categories, a matter of ethnicity, ancestry, customs, or historical trajectory? So if we look at the category of Sephardic, for example, we can argue that Sephardic is a pan-ethnic sort of like category, an imperfect umbrella category for a whole range of, let's say, non-Ashkenazi Jews. We can argue that being Sephardic is about having ancestry that originally came from the Iberian Peninsula. There's scholars who argue that being Sephardic is about minhag and halacha, about Jewish law and Jewish custom. There's even some work, by the way, about genetics and being Sephardic. You can really try to apply a whole range of definitional orientations to this category. And then lastly, one question that I think a lot about, and part of my future research will focus on this, is what is the relationship? And I would say here, is there a relationship between Sephardic and Mizrahi, which are specifically Jewish identity categories, and then American racial and ethnic classification categories? Can we assume that there is a relationship between how these categories are used? To make this a little bit less abstract, when I talk to people, I tell them my mom was born in Melilla, which is a Spanish province in Northern Africa. And she's pretty white and she's Sephardic. And I have some really wonderful friends who are African-American Ashkenazi Jews. So we need to do some real important work in order to figure out, when we use these categories, what is the relationship between them? Is there a relationship between them? So I hope what I did right now, before I go to my last set of questions, what I did right now is try to show some of the findings that we have about diversity of the American Jewish experience, and also hopefully argue that a research project that should continue from this and our level of understanding about who American Jews are needs to incorporate a whole range of questions, competing definitions, and important scholarly approaches towards these things in order to help us do the good work that we need to continue doing. What I'll do right now, and with this, I will then take some questions. I'll end with the following. Like I said before, when I write and when I talk about my research, I don't only do it as a researcher, I'm also very involved in different communal initiatives and communal conversations about diversity, equity, and inclusion, about just questions of diversity in terms of the American Jewish community. And these are just 4 questions that I wanted to pose, right? As questions that I think sit at the center of a complex and exciting, but also challenging in the best of ways, challenging in the sense that it requires hard work, diversity project. So I'm just going to name these questions, and I'll try to give some examples of what I mean with each of them. First question: how can we elevate and embrace diversity without flattening the differences between multiple communities of diverse Jews? A lot of the discourse, and again, I just want to put it out there, I assume that all this is from a really positive place, and that it's always done in good faith. But a lot of the discourse about the diversity of Jews ends up creating these really, really big categories, and sometimes just really flattening really significant difference. So, for example, one thing that I try to say to people, it's if we think about, let's say, Asian Jews and Hispanic Jews, they might not, as a random example, they might not necessarily see themselves as being the same in one particular way. And if we talk of all of them of all Jews who are not white and or non-Ashkenazi in the same way, right? Sometimes we might run the risk of essentially reifying these monolithic categories that flatten difference, let's say, between the experience of Sephardic Jews in the US and the experience of Mizrahi Jews in Israel. And this is important. It's important in terms of scholarship because it could be an impediment to understanding. It's also important in terms of representation because people might not feel seen and they might not feel like their stories are being heard when they're not being described in terms that they find familiar and they recognize. So this is the first question how do we embrace the project of diversity, the project of elevating representations of Jews that maybe complicate our assumptions that we used to have, but we do so in a way that recognizes there's diversity within diversity, right? That we cannot just put this, bucket of Jews who look different than us and imagine that they're all the same. They might actually have like different political views, different moral views, different ways of thinking about themselves and their Jewishness. That's question number one. Question number two, and this one's a tricky one in terms of of communal politics and how to do some of this work. And I'll explain in a second why I raised this question. But the question is, how can we negotiate the tension between progressive values that often underlie diversity projects with the political heterodoxy, traditionalism, and conservatism in some diverse Jewish communities? I'll give you a little bit of a taste of why I'm asking this question. I found myself in this pretty funny social situation that I didn't pursue, but just happened, in that half of my social life is what I would describe as red America, very politically conservative. And this half of my social life happens to be the half that researchers and activists would describe as Jews of color or diverse Jews, either fellow immigrants or Sephardic Jews or Mizrahi Jews, not all of them, but most of them. The other half of my life, again, I'm generalizing a bit, is what I would call very blue America, very progressive, very much on the left. And it's overwhelmingly, and not everybody, but overwhelmingly white and Ashkenazi Jews that I work with and do research with. And I identify this almost there's sometimes a little bit of a gap between my two worlds, in which sometimes I hear, people who are advocating for diversity, but who don't always understand or want to reconcile with the fact that sometimes individuals who themselves represent diversity, that they might actually have a really different moral outlook, right, as to the world. And here I'm a student of, a student by reading, not a personal student, of anthropologists like Richard Schroeder, for example, cultural anthropologists, who essentially argue that the different societies and cultures that we come from, not in an essentializing way, but in a way that talks about social development and historical trajectory, that they very often have different and competing moral frameworks through which to see the world, which to me implies that part of the complex and disruptive, in the best ways, project of diversity is to insist that diverse Jews, if we're going to use the category for a second, are going to be different from each other. They might have different political views. They might have different moral ways of approaching the world. And specifically, liberal diversity projects are going to have to negotiate what it means to want to hold up the value of diversity, and the value of just a genuine understanding of who people are at the same time. Third question. How can we promote research that is meant to serve and or promote valuable DEI communal goal, diversity, equity, and inclusion, while encouraging academic rigor and open inquiry? I'll tell you what I mean by this. Some of what I've noticed in my circles is that there's a very well-meaning assumption that some people have that certain moral projects need to align with certain social facts. Let me tell you what I mean with an example. When Pew came out, I got into a friendly Facebook argument with an Ashkenazi friend of mine, because we're talking about the percentage that Pew said are Sephardic or Mizrahi Jews in the US, 7%. And I said, I have some quibbles with this. I actually disagree with how Pew asked the questions. I think the number is probably a little bit higher. But, it's not when I look at this number, I'm not shocked. And my friend was actually upset with me. He said, but Mijal, haven't we been so Ashkenormative for so long? Don't we need to talk about Sephardic Jews? Aren't there way more Sephardic Jews? And what I'm trying to explain here is that he was almost arguing that the project of inclusivity, right, was almost tied with thinking of this community as much greater, and with assuming that researchers had undercounted, let's say, my communities, and that part of the work to challenge Ashkenormativity was actually to have a greater number. I would agree with him if I thought that there was like mistaken scholarship in the ways that that numbers were achieved. But that conversation really brought to mind some of the challenges in this work. I have this challenge myself. I have communal professionals and activists who want me to give percentages of like Sephardic and Mizrahi Jews. And I know that very often, because of importance of representation, that higher percentages serve a political and positive purpose. And at the same time, I also have an obligation as a researcher to figure out what do we know and how we know it, and to want to have honesty and rigor in the way that I want to do research. So I'm just bringing it here and raising it as a really important question about how we negotiate some of this dynamics in terms of wanting to promote certain moral goals, and at the same time wanting to hold on very strongly to our academic values and principles of rigor and open inquiry. The last question that I'll give, this is my question, then I'll take yours, but that I'll give is really just, and it feels like a very personal question for me, but like, how do we promote diverse representation without tokenizing, without basically, one of the ways that I describe this is right now, the communities that I come from, whether the Persian community or like different Sephardic communities that I identify with, they end up being, most of them are fairly insular communities. So very often I'm the only person, like a Sephardic Jew from the Middle East, that many people in my other circles meet. And there's often like a sense or a danger, let's say, of tokenization, of either expecting that one person needs to represent your group, or looking at this one person and saying, well, you do represent your group, right? Your entire group must look this way. If this is, if these are your views, and if this is your way of looking at the world. So I think this is one of the questions that we need to figure out. And I'll conclude with just one anecdote that to me really raised this very strongly to me. This was maybe, I don't know, 4 years ago. I was invited to be at a conference, and I was asked to be in a panel to talk about questions of gender and feminism. And when I received the invitation, I called the organizer, and I wanted to kind of understand why they asked me to speak, right? And she said, oh, well, you're a Sephardic Jew. And it was a little bit funny. I'm like, okay, I'd rather you said that I study Sephardic Jews as well, because that should be part of this conversation. It shouldn't only be that, and then I get to speak on behalf of my people. And then something funny happened at the panel. I was sitting there, and I had this realization. That part of the reason that I was sitting there, I hope I can say this elegantly and succinctly, is that I was a Sephardic Jew of a specific background who could speak liberal feminism, because I'm a liberal feminist myself. And I paused the panel at one point, I did it in a very friendly manner. And I said, I just want to make a point right now that the reason that I'm here is because I happen to be a Sephardic Jew, and I happen to also be a liberal feminist, and I can speak in a language that everybody in this liberal audience can understand me. But I actually want to emphasize that most of the individuals in the communities that I come from approach the world and approach questions of gender in a really different way. And if we really want to have this complicated diversity conversation to try to get different perspectives, then it'd be good to not only have someone like me, but also have someone like, my cousin, or like my sister-in-law, or whatever, in order to understand the different cultural logics that different diverse Jews bring to the table when talking about these important matters. So to conclude with this, I'll just say that my hope right now was really to emphasize that, sorry, let me just pause my PowerPoint, to emphasize that it's really important, and I'm really heartened by the fact that so many researchers, activists, and communal leaders in the Jewish community have really taken up the mantle of trying to explore important questions of diversity. And that as we do it, we need to keep in the forefront of our minds the fact that it's going to involve a whole layer of really critical questions, both for researchers who are trying to do this work in terms of categories, definitions, classifications, and also just for our communities who are trying to do this important and difficult work of representation. How do we approach this in a way that balances different values and principles and takes them into account? So I'll conclude with this, and Natan, hopefully you'll join me soon. Great, okay.
Thank you so much, Mijal, for that really enlightening and provocative talk. There's a lot of questions that come up for me for sure, and we've had questions coming up in the Q&A as well, and I encourage people to continue to ask your questions via the Q&A box. So maybe I'll just start by asking you to briefly explain Pew 2020 and what it is for those who may not be familiar with the study, just to give a brief overview to folks.
Sure. So Pew is a nonpartisan research center, and they do a lot of studies on different populations. Sometimes they study religious groups. Sometimes they focus, let's say, on like political opinions of different like racial groups or ethnic groups. And in 2013, Pew conducted its first national study of Jewish Americans. And then they kind of did their second study of Jewish Americans in 2020. And part of the reason this is important is that a lot of our knowledge, each field is different, right? So the field of sociology of Jews is a very interesting field because part of it is made up of, let's say, like academics who are like, at universities, but a lot of it is made up of surveys and studies that are done in community institutions. So let's say like a federation would hire a team of researchers and they would conduct like a communal study, right? Or we had, a national study previously done that was commissioned by folks in the Jewish community. So this was important because it was the first national quantitative study that was conducted by a nonpartisan institution. So that's why it has, I think, a really significant way given to it in terms of how it shapes the conversations.
Great, thank you. So there were a few questions about racial categories, and the questions came in from the audience, but I had some similar questions myself coming up because I know American Jews of Ashkenazi descent, of European descent, who often call themselves provisionally white. And there's a couple of folks asked similar questions. For example, there are many people like myself who are Ashkenazi but look Sephardic or Mizrahi. This is the questioner's words. I never fully self-identified as white in the normative sense for this reason. Are there not many Jews of Eastern European background who still look Middle Eastern because we have often been a mobile people? So isn't there also a middle ground even amongst the Ashkenazim? And then another person asked, as an American-born Jew with Israeli parents, I have always marked other on race ethnicity questions. Is there a more accurate or helpful response I should be providing? Given the context of American anti-Semitism, white does not feel accurate. On the other hand, the ability to pass as white or non-Jewish ignorance of anti-Semitism means that identifying as non-white can also feel deceptive.
Yeah, all of these questions. It's really complicated. And I would say that right now, part of what's complicated is that the stakes feel high, that it doesn't feel like, you just mentioned anti-Semitism, it doesn't feel merely like a removed, right, like academic discussion. The stakes feel high at a moment in which we're really talking a lot about racism, we're talking about anti-Semitism. And I think that the stakes being high means that these conversations are difficult and complicated. I guess I'll just have two reactions without telling anybody how to identify in a survey. But I'll just reaffirm what you said about like the provisionality of whiteness. Eric Goldstein's work on the price of whiteness, he really talks about, and he focuses mostly on Ashkenazi Jews, but he talks about whiteness as something that Jews negotiate in America, which means it's something you can achieve and you can also lose in different circumstances. And part of his really important historical work was actually to track and to show how there were times in which Jews were racialized, like for example, in the earlier part of the 1900s, in which Jews were racialized, right? So they almost like they lose their position in terms of whiteness in the US. And then there's times when they achieve it. So I think that's really complicated, as is the conversation around like anti-Semitism and its relationship with whiteness. I'll quote here, not an academic, but a comedian called David Badiel from England, the UK, who had an interesting segment last week in which, again, it is less an academic statement, but one that has to do with the public discourse, I would say, in which he says, he basically, I'm not going to quote him exactly, but he said a lot of times politically the whiteness of Jews has to do less with Jews and more with those who are, the politics of those who are observing Jews. And what he explained is that at the extremes, so we're talking here, the political extremes, the far left or the far right, you could argue, and again, it's complicated, that Jews are either seen as non-white, so by white nationalists, or they're seen as like hyper-white in terms of being the symbols of whiteness and privilege. So I thought that was a really insightful, I appreciated that comment in terms of the contemporary conversation, and I just wanted to highlight the complications of this. And the other thing I'll say is that, we can talk a lot about like passing and what we look like. A lot of the conversation around whiteness really has to do with like, what are the systems that individuals have been privy that they could like benefit from and have access to in this country. And some of that has to do with how we look, and some of that has to do with how we present. And a lot of that also has to do with just having ancestors who could legally check off a certain category and not others. So it's complicated. I'll say here that I think that we haven't really interrogated the category of other. Like, I want there to be more research as to the percentage of Jews who check off others in surveys, because I imagine that this is going to include a whole array of people. It's going to include Middle Eastern Jews, because census categories don't include Middle Eastern as an option that people can check off, right? So it's going to include Middle Eastern Jews. It's also going to include Ashkenazi white passing Jews who just really don't feel white for a variety of reasons, whether it's anti-Semitism or any of the other things that you mentioned. And I think that this category deserves greater interrogation and greater attention given to it.
Fantastic, thank you. There were some questions about definitions. For example, kind of a foundational definition of when you say Jewishness, or when we talk about Judaism, what are we talking about? Someone asked, what is your foundational definition of Jewishness? What is it that all Jews have in common, from which we then begin to differentiate? My colleague, Lawrence Spielman, who teaches ancient Jewish history here at PSU, asked, in the study of Jewish antiquity, scholars sometimes deal with the issue of diversity by positing the existence of multiple Judaisms. And do you think we face the same situation in contemporary Judaism, that the best way to describe our diversity is to speak of various Judaisms? And then also there were a couple questions about specific definitions. How is the definition of Hispanic that you use, how is that created? Is that the for example, is that the official one that's used in the census by the government? And what about Asian Jews as well? Because those didn't seem to fall into the definitions you used about Jews of color.
Sure, happy to clarify that. First of all, it's funny, I was about to quote, there's a quote by Jacob Neusner who talks about Judaisms as well, saying that the word Jewish requires community, right? A social group to essentially bring it into being. And if we talk about communities, then we're going to talk about Judaisms. And that definitely is an approach that I take. I wouldn't say like in my social or personal life, saying, we have Judaisms here, but especially in my research. And, I'm working right now on a book project on Syrian Jews. I spend a lot of time trying to give a thick description of what Judaism looks like there, right? What is it? And I actually think it's super important to try to understand the different genealogies, right, that we use. So as an example, there's a lot of interesting scholarship, for example, on the category of religion and how it was shaped in like a Protestant setting, and it has its own Western Protestant genealogy. Why do I say this? Can I apply the same category of religion that I, let's say, like apply for some group of Jews? Can I apply them to Syrian Jews, right, who came from a Muslim majority context and whose Judaism developed in a place that didn't have that notion of religiosity? So I definitely think that we need to we need to pay close attention to the ways that Jewishness is understood, negotiated, and practiced in different environments, and that it's going to look differently in different places. And I'll add here as a communal note, I even think it's a little bit healthy to do this. What I mean by this is that I think sometimes some polarization or some division in terms of our communities can come when we expect sameness and we don't get it, right? So if we expect to get to the same conclusions and we don't take the moment to understand the genealogies and trajectories that led us here, and the fact that you define Jewishness in one way and I in another, then arguably the potential for frustration, disappointment, and misunderstandings can be greater than if we come to the table and we say, you know, we have different notions of what this means and what it looks like and what we're promoting. And that could arguably just be a different type of conversation. In terms of just categories, again, this is just like really messy. If anybody wants to learn more about Hispanic Jews and the categories to think about them, I recommend Laura Limonic's work. It's called Kugel and Frijoles. So that's like a very good just like exploration of survey data and just the population of Hispanic Jews in the US. Asian Jews are definitely, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear, there was an option in Pew to check off, you know, being of Asian, identifying as Asian, and definitely most formulations of the category of Jews of color that I've heard include Asian Jews. So definitely that's part of the conversation. And there's also from a communal, not research perspective, you know, in terms of like anti-Asian hate crime, there's definitely been advocacy in terms of standing up and supporting generally Asians in America, but also Asian Jews, you know, and their place in our communities.
Thank you. I'm just looking at all these different great questions, and I want to be mindful of time as well. One of our students in our Judaic Studies program says, I come from a Jewish and non-Jewish background, and there is a clear red and blue state difference between the two, as you said. And so sometimes I feel my red state, the red state way that I was raised, feels out of place among certain Jews. And I'm willing to give up some of this to fit in, but not enough to remove it completely. How can I fit in while retaining my dual identity? Sounds like you might be a really good person to ask.
Yeah, I mean, this is not, none of this is easy, not only because of the identities we bring, but because we're living in a moment of such high polarization and political tribalism, you know, that we have in this country right now. Yeah, I'm happy to talk offline, but also I'm just saying, yeah, I guess some of the work that's near to my heart right now that I'm involved in is work around pluralism. I really believe, again, this is me not speaking as a scholar of Sephardic Jews right now, but just as like an American citizen and as a Jew who loves this country. I believe that we need to think seriously about pluralism as an American value and as a Jewish value. And I think some of the place where the rubber hits the road and the questions that come up right now, it used to be that we had issues with denominational pluralism, right? With like Jews who believed in different versions of God or halacha, Jewish law, being able to work together. I think that's a little bit dated. I think the real, if I'm being a little bit, tongue in cheek, I would say like we don't care about God as much as we care about politics. So it's a little bit easier to kind of have denominational pluralism. What I think is a challenge right now is to have political pluralism. And it's hard because so many of us feel for good reason that this is not just about politics, it's about really deep moral values and visions of the good and what makes for a just society. But here, I guess I'll just say that I'm a student of Isaiah Berlin, a student by reading, and Isaiah Berlin, who was very famous Jewish philosopher from England and a very big proponent of values pluralism. Berlin talks about pluralism as something that involves compromise and that is not easy, not necessarily the slogan that all the young people just want to do because it's exciting, but he describes it as the only way to have coexistence and to avert kind of like some sort of like social catastrophe of just us letting our tribal passions take over. I guess I'll just say that that I think it's really hard, and I think it's really urgently critical that all of us, regardless of where we come from, that we ask these questions.
Thank you. Someone asked, there is a perception of an estrangement of identification with the Zionist character of Israel by the younger American Jewish generation. How different or similar is such estrangement among young Sephardic Jews in America?
Right, great question. So we do see definitely amongst all the surveys and all the polls, when we look generally at just like younger Jews, they have, I would say, like a combination of more indifferent and or more negative attitudes towards Israel and its government. I don't have survey data because it doesn't exist, not yet, but in terms of my ethnographic research and my, my involvement in various Sephardic communities, I would say that Sephardic communities, specifically those who were shaped by immigration from the Middle East and Northern Africa. So I'm not including here the descendants of like the original Sephardic Jews who came in colonial times. But in terms of these communities, they definitely, I would say, have an incredibly strong attachment to Israel and are very strongly Zionistic. I would say that they generally have an affiliation with the right-wing political spectrum in terms of American politics. And part of that is because of Israel. Often when they talk, this wasn't the question, but I'll say often when they talk about their countries of origin, they express an allegiance and nostalgia for their Jewish communities in those countries of origins, but they have no nationalistic attachment to those countries. And they often view those vis-a-vis the Arab-Israeli conflict. So that might affect some of their views towards Israel. I would say, by the way, it's like an aside, but Russian-speaking Jews are generally are more similar as well. And one of the things that I hope to explore in my research, I think some of the blind spots that we have in terms of our diversity conversations is that we don't pay enough attention to immigration, particularly immigration of Jews to the US after 1965. I say 65 because that's the year in which immigration law became more liberalized and certain discriminatory quotas were removed. So whether we talk about Iranian Jews, about Lebanese and Egyptian and Syrian Jews who came after 65, about Bukharian Jews, Russian-speaking Jews, many of them happen to be much more politically conservative, loosely, right-wing, and much more Zionistic, and have a much more collectivist morality.
Thank you. That does highlight even further the complexity of American Jewry and the American Jewish experience, which I think is one of the messages you're trying to put across tonight. And I dare say with your body of work in general, that seems to be at least one of your important goals, which seems so important and never more important than today. So I'm really grateful to you for bringing that message to us and these questions. Unfortunately, we couldn't get to all of the questions that were asked in the Q&A. There were a lot of really good ones. But I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Dr. Bitton, for being with us virtually tonight and asking these thought-provoking questions, opening up new intellectual vistas for people to understand. I want to again thank our sponsors and especially Dick Solomon and Elise Flitcraft for tonight's event and for this lecture series, and to thank everyone here tonight for being with us. If you know people who were interested in attending but couldn't make it, we will have a recording available on our website soon. And again, thanks to everyone for coming, and I wish you all a very good night.